Um, well, this have you ever used Riverside by chance?
Yes, but never live. I don't know.
Uh, I've been
I don't.
having some issues.
I've done interviews on Riverside.
Yeah. All right. All right. Well, this is recording now. So I will, of course, edit this before we go, before I post. Uh, so three, two, one. Thank you so much for joining us. We have with us today Peter Newell. I'll read Newell's bio here. Peter Newell is the CEO of BM&T, an advisory company focused on helping the government innovate. Colonel Newell is also the former director of the Army's Rapid Equipping Force and the co-founder of the Hacking for Defense program that has changed how national security problem sets are solved. Colonel Newell, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for the opportunity.
So, first question, I'm going to flip a question at you that I asked Professor Blank earlier this week, and that is that we have spent collectively in the national security community a lot of time focused on how we're going to solve acquisitions processes from the perspective of the U.S. military. My opinion is that those are critical challenges that we face in the country from the perspective of the national security community. However, I want to flip a question that kind of inverts that equation as well, and that yes, the national security community, uh, through our acquisitions processes, could better engage alternative suppliers, startups, new entrants into the defense industrial base. Yes, that is absolutely a challenge. However, uh, from the opposite perspective, how do we drive more folks, more startups, more founders, more folks at the research labs into national security problem sets in driving more interest in tackling these big problems?
We need a Pied Piper. It's. I don't know. And drive isn't the word that I would say is you need to create um, to get velocity of delivery, of delivering things more faster. You have to have a certain volume of things coming in. So the question is, how do you entice more people to engage with national security problems and actually stick with it? And you could take every group you just mentioned and look at them and say, why don't more academic researchers get involved with national security things? And the reality, nothing against academic researchers, but most academic researchers are professional academic researchers. They don't start companies. They do research in order to spin out IP that other people license and do something with. Um, but they're not entrepreneurs. They don't start companies, and they certainly don't look at the difficulty of transitioning research into something else as a lifelong passion. So the real question is how do we start over again with some of these things, and how do we recreate an environment where we don't necessarily just do research for the sake of research, but we're doing research with the intent on discovering um, pathways to more rapidly solve the problems that are presenting themselves, or we find pathways to accelerate technologies that will make whole problem sets go away. That at the most basic element is kind of the question you have to start asking. From DoD's perspective, it's less a conversation about innovation than it is about how do we accelerate our ability to accomplish our mission in an environment where our challenges are accelerating. And I'm very careful to say it doesn't matter if the Department of War goes faster, if our protagonists are still going faster than them. We need to invert that relationship.
Very good. Thank you so much. So second question is this: what do those in the R&D community, encompassing research laboratories, founders, and so forth, need to understand about this current moment in the defense industrial base? A wave of new acquisitions, reforms initiated by the U.S. military. How do we in Chicago tap into these reforms and grow our national security community? And I'm talking about Chicago. I could be talking about other markets outside of your quote unquote superstar cities.
I think from everybody's perspective, the reforms provide the Department of War all of the authority to make the changes they need to make what they're doing go faster. I think if I were sitting on the outside looking at that, the first question is, do I have access to the problems or the portfolio of problems that they're trying to solve? And then do I have the network built around me that will enable me to get on a rather fast-moving treadmill at the speed it's moving? So it's if I'm sitting in Chicago and I'm at the heart of all of the great work that's done there, I start to say, first is, are we in Chicago getting access to the problems that the government needs to solve? Do we understand when they need to be solved and in what environment? And then do we have access to the networks that allow us to move fast enough to engage in that environment and actually do really good work that is, value to us, value to our community, and value to our nation?
I'm a founder. I am not familiar with the national security industry and defense industrial base. What's my entry point? Where do I start?
Search for problems. I think you're a founder. You literally, I would start with the Department of War directory that Steve and others produced, and I would start ripping that thing apart. I would sit down with Gemini or Claude or whatever AI system you use, punch in the technology that you think you're working on, and ask it to tell you what are the problems the Department of War is trying to solve that involve the technology. And then I would take it one step further and say, who are the people I need to contact to ask about this problem that will help me understand what I'm supposed to do? That's the first hour. The second hour, you get on the phone and start talking to people.
And then the primes. Talk to me about the relationship that you can expect vis-a-vis the primes and how founders should be navigating that kind of environment.
Primes are not a bad thing. So I think in your research, if you find out that there's a prime actually working on a problem that you think your technology aligns with, then I would be talking to the primes because they have the same problem. The primes are interested in creating a supply chain that allows them to answer the government's problems, and they're really good about writing checks. And I mean not necessarily venture capital checks, but actually grant checks. And if they see an example of a technology they need somewhere down the road that answers a problem they're trying to solve, they actually invest their own dollars in making you a better company that can actually solve their problem without actually taking your equity away. Then in some cases, they are eventually the acquirers. I've sat on the board for a couple of companies that quite frankly, one that was involved in wireless power that Lockheed Martin put a lot of money into because that company might enable Lockheed Martin to reduce the size of the wiring harness in the F-35 aircraft, which might help them reduce 1,000 pounds of weight from the aircraft. So you really have to listen to the weak signals that there's a problem that a prime has that you can solve.
Sorry, I was Terry had checked in with me about something. Uh, so you have cautioned against founders, new ventures going into this space, and I'm going to use your words here, thinking you're going to be the next Palantir, because that Endural, SpaceX, as you know, backed by billionaires. So, what do you say to folks who might be thinking about dual use go-to-market? I'm sorry, Professor Blanks cautioned me against that term. Defense go-to-market strategies without having a billionaire behind you, but still wanting to scale.
You know, there's nothing wrong with being a $100 million, $200 million company. You know, I tell folks that, you know, I built BM&T, that, you know, we've done $150 million worth of work with the government without any private equity, without any loans, without any venture capital. There are, I would say, tens of thousands of companies that are required to support the defense industrial base and the defense innovation base that are small businesses, not venture backed, not future billion-dollar unicorns. So for every unicorn out there, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of other really quality companies out there doing great stuff. So if your metric is, you know, I want to be a unicorn and raise that kind of money, so be it. Make sure you're working on, you know, a problem that is way the hell out there. If that's not the case, and you really are passionate about what you do, that's okay. You don't have to be a unicorn and actually to grow a great company that delivers a great product that does those great things for our country.
Right, great feedback. Focusing things on Chicago for a second, we have devoted a ton of energy, capital, mobilized a bunch of stakeholders toward being a hub of activity in the quantum sciences. I recognize there are competitors, but that is at the core of our economic development strategy here in Chicago right now.
Okay.
Talk to me about the intersection between the U.S. military's interests in the quantum sciences and how we can activate value creation for the U.S. military in a range of fields involving quantum.
I would say the U.S. military does not know the full extent to which quantum will be employed or deployed in the national security space. I think we're just scratching the surface with it so far in terms of quantum secured communications or quantum crypto. I think the interesting things about quantum is one thing, but the supply chain of things attached to quantum are also quite different. When you think about quantum will allow us to evaluate data that we never thought was important before, which means we never even considered gathering, which means we're going to be gathering data at a scale never imagined. And we're going to be employing sensors at a scale never imagined in terms of whether they're nanosensors or they proliferate everywhere. You know, those acts are going to change the way the world actually behaves. You know, think about, and I go back to, you know, I started in the military in 1980. We were still putting camouflage nets over vehicles and in order to hide from overflying air. I mean, satellites weren't an issue. We didn't think about that. Now it's like you can't hide anything anywhere. So that changes, you know, ultimately the way doctrine works. It changes the way we fight. Everything changes all of a sudden. So if I'm at the hub of quantum, you know, a certain amount of my energy is just going, what new problems does quantum create for an old system? And then what new opportunities does quantum create, you know, based on changes to that? I don't want to say it's a lot of theoretical stuff, but I have friends who have been working on, um, I call it quantum software, since quantum was first being talked about, and they said, we're trying to discover as it grows what it is that we need to, what the formulas need to be. It just we got a long way to go. I challenge anybody in DoD who says they've got a grip on what quantum is going to mean to them. Quantum is going to create a whole new dynamic on the battlefield, and I don't think we've figured out yet what that is.
I had two more questions, and I'm going to recycle one from my conversation with Professor Blank the other day, and it's regarding manufacturing. We've seen a bunch of new dollars from the venture space flow into defense-related manufacturing. I'm going to quote a PitchBook study here. Roughly $500 million from 22 to 23 to 4.7 billion across 39 deals in 25. We at least aspire to regain a lot of the manufacturing that we have lost in Chicago and the Midwest. How can defense and national security space play a role in bringing manufacturing back to Chicago, a city largely rooted in manufacturing and the industrial Midwest?
Yeah, $5 billion isn't going to do it. The manufacturing issues in the United States are a whole government issue. And it's everywhere from the Department of War needs to change the way it buys and secures supply lines and supply chains of things, but they can't do that if they don't exist, which means you actually have to have factories and you have to have parts that are being built and parts that go places. But in order to have factories, you have to have workers, which means you have to have an education system that values manufacturing, so people can do that. And it's just one big do loop because somebody actually has to put their foot down and say, okay, I'm building a factory and I know it's going to lose money for a while, but by God, we're going to do that. I think you saw some of that with some of the pushback that President Trump had for the primes and said, you guys are buying back shares instead of building national manufacturing capacity. Build a capacity. So there's some behavior changing that has to happen amongst the people who have the capital and the wherewithal to do things. I think there's also some behavior changes that have to happen locally. Let's talk about Chicago. How many schools in Chicago are actually producing students who have the technical capability to run computer or numerical controlled equipment? If I ask Lockheed Martin that question about the Dallas-Fort Worth area, they'll tell you there's 7, and they hire every student that comes out of them to work on the F-35 production line. So we already can't get enough people to do it, and I won't even talk about chip production. So at the most basic level, we have to start with how do we get a workforce geared up to do those jobs. But at the same time, we have to build the plants that the workforce is going to work in. And at the same time, we have to actually build a demand for the parts and pieces of things that we need to deliver. Now, the beauty of working on problems that I'll call them attritable systems is that they're going to attrit, which is going to increase the demand for us to produce things that the people can use. I give you an example from last week. I was reading an article on Renault in France, the car manufacturer who's actually now manufacturing unmanned aerial systems for the Ukraine. So, as you look at the factories and places, in Chicago, and say, is Motorola going to start manufacturing something other than radios for what they do? Alongside and actually build a new manufacturing line that does something that's not necessarily what's been in the core strength forever, but is now focused on something that the Department of War will need in the future.
That's great. Last question. As I mentioned before we went live here, we are a new organization, Frontier Mission Network. We are building a channel between our city and the national security community. Your colleague, Steve Blank, has flagged that in the previous administration, there were 200 incubators tied to the U.S. military and suggested they'll be shut down if they're not tied to acquisition dollars using the term innovation theaters. Of course, I mean, our organization is associated with the U.S. military. We're a private organization, but at a high level, the point I think he's trying to make is a relevant one for us, and that is we don't want to go build another innovation theater. How do we, from my selfish perspective, not build an innovation theater, but actively engage with national security problems and solve problems?
I think number one is you build the funnel for that thing that starts with problems, and not made up problems, but problems that people actually have. So problem sourcing and problem curation and prioritization should be 50% of the budget for that incubator, if not more. We use Einstein's theory. They spend 90% of your time making sure you got the right problem, you understand it before you try to solve it. Part two is those problems that you bring onto your platform need to actually have an exit strategy. And if you can't identify an exit strategy, Steve would say, if they are not tied to something that is actively being worked on, and you can identify the person or program that's involved with it, and you've not ever had a conversation with them, it does not belong on your platform. It doesn't mean it's not valuable, but you still have more work to do to bring it in. So I'm a little more fine, I would say refined than Steve is on the theory. I don't think we have 300 incubators out there. I think we have 30. And we have 270 out there that call themselves innovation platforms who contribute but don't deliver. We don't need more hackathons unless you're just looking for ideas and stuff like that. But don't make the mistake of thinking you're going to run a hackathon and solve a problem. You may learn some things, but you have to admit if it is not problem driven and it is not tied to accelerating the accomplishment of somebody's mission, you're wasting your time and money. I think you froze on me, Thomas.
Because your response was still recorded, even though I was cut out. That was the only question I had. The only questions I have. While we're still recording here, any final words of advice?
I think if you throw all of my responses in a bag with Steve's bag and responses and mix them together, you'll actually have some pretty good stuff.
I bet. All right, I'm going to stop recording here. Thank you so much.